sign in. Your attendance today is greatly appreciated. We are going to be taking a deeper dive into the Buy American provision, the tracking of non-domestic food items, and that will be about the first hour of the presentation. And then the second hour will be reviewing the additional program requirements that you need to be aware of, and more centered towards our bookkeepers, what needs to be happening now. So let's move to the next slide. Your presenters for today, we have Katie Parch, the Director of the Child Nutrition Programs at the Nebraska Department of Education Nutrition Services. She is joining us today. She will be presenting on the Buy American provision, the tracking of non-domestic food items, a new requirement from USDA. We have Erica Arter, our wonderful Zoom operator. She will be talking about those additional requirements that you need to be aware of as a bookkeeper. And then myself, I'm Shawn Bondrotchek. Erica and I are program specialists that work in the school meals program. Next slide. Some housekeeping tips that we need to cover today. We ask that you use the chat box to ask questions. And you may have questions, so please put them in the chat box. We will be covering the Buy American questions at the end of that section. And then we will be covering the additional requirements that we will be discussing for bookkeepers at the end of that section. So there will be two different opportunities that we will be addressing questions. You will be muted during the presentation, but certainly unmuted during the question and answer time. And if you feel like you can explain your question better than putting it in the chat box, that is perfectly fine. Please come off of mute and ask your question at the appropriate time. So next slide. Now, more housekeeping tips. We just want to remind everyone that the 2025 Bookkeeper Zoom presentations, handouts, and slide deck are posted on the Nutrition Services website under training. So all of our recorded training has been posted. This presentation will be also posted in about a week or two. So it will also be available for your viewing. The food service training that happened this summer is also posted at the same location. So if you need a refresher on the information that you heard during the food service training, the live trainings that were held this summer, you can go to our website and click on the specific topic that you have questions about. The slide deck and handouts for today's presentation have been emailed to you, and we ask that you have the handouts available. If you want to take notes on the slide deck, please feel free to do that. They are also posted under training on the Nutrition Services website. You are receiving 2 hours of professional standards training today for attending our presentation. The certificate for training is the first page of the handout packet. And if you do not have an SNA number, remember that's not required. And if you are a bookkeeper, and that is your title, Claim Contact Bookkeeper, you can certainly complete the certificate, but the certificate is designed for our food service staff that have to have so many hours of professional standards training per year. So next slide. Once again, we've had some people join us, and so I am going to enter in the chat box the Google sheet that we ask that you complete to indicate that you attended today's training. And so that's been entered in the chat box. If you just click on the link, it'll take you to the Google form to complete. Now, our agenda for today, as I mentioned, it is divided into two different sections. The first section is the Buy American tracking of non-domestic food items. And then in our second hour, our second section, we will be addressing additional program requirements, which include the list that you see on the slide. So I will not be going through each one of those other than to say it is important to make sure that we are continuing to establish eligibility for newly enrolled students. A reminder about the carryover period, submitting the claim for reimbursement, food safety inspections, the required edit check, verification, on-site reviews, and other important dates. So let's move to the next slide. And I would like to introduce Katie Parch, our Director of Nutrition Services. Katie?
Yep, I'm ready. Thank you.
Super. Yeah. I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to us about the Buy American provision and the changes that have occurred.
Yeah, you're right. There are some pretty important changes that everyone in the school nutrition programs needs to be aware of. And as you mentioned and was noted on the previous slide, that tracking this information is required for all schools. So I want to make sure you know that as Erica and Sean have indicated, the information and recording from today's training will be available on the website. And we make announcements and share that information out. So look for that coming in the next couple of weeks, because we understand that other people at your school who may need to be aware of this information as it impacts their job responsibilities would benefit from hearing this information as well. So we have a recorded training. It's the same information I'm going to share with you today, available on the website already. But like my teammates noted, this is going to be made available too. So there are two options for which other folks at your school can hear this training and see it. And it's also an opportunity for you to go back and rewatch any of the slides or content that you want to make sure you understand really well. You can move on to the next slide, Erica. Thank you. The Buy American provision has long been a requirement of the school nutrition programs, and there have been important changes made that are effective in school year 25-26. And we'll cover that today. But the provision is intended to support the provision of healthy school meals, and the school nutrition programs are intended to support domestic agriculture as well as farm to school, which is a significant part of Nebraska's school nutrition programs. This provision requires schools to maximize their purchases of domestically produced menu items. We want that public federal funds that is used to provide support for the nutrition programs to be put back into the local economy. And this is one of the provisions that helps support that. So the updated requirements for the Buy American provision have set a cap on the non-domestic purchases that are represented as a percentage of your total food purchases for food items used in the breakfast and lunch meals served through the school nutrition programs. And this year we're beginning with a 10% cap on non-domestic purchases, slowly over time working our way down to a 5% non-domestic purchase cap. Next slide. So after this component of today's bookkeeper office hours training, you should be able to explain the Buy American provision to others at your school who need to be aware of what it requires. You will understand the two exceptions that are available to the requirements for domestic purchases or the requirements of the Buy American provision. And you should be able to execute the documentation requirements for the Buy American provision, including the required submission of an accommodation request for school year 25-26 if it's necessary for your school. And we'll cover each of these more in depth as we move through the slides today. So the Buy American provision, first and foremost, like everything in the school nutrition programs, requires record keeping, and maybe somewhat different from the other job duties that you have in the school nutrition programs, of course, requires communication with business managers and others at the school. The folks who are responsible for menu planning may not be the same people who are responsible for making purchases. And there has to be close and regular communication between both of those positions and potentially others at your school to ensure that you're complying with this requirement. I mentioned that this is an essential provision of the National School Lunch Program. The updated language related to the provision also defines the word substantially when it comes to menu items or ingredient items you're purchasing that might have a mixture of both non-domestic and domestic items used to comprise that final product. And I denoted those with that orange, dark orange, almost red colored asterisk because I'll remind you of that substantially definition when I highlight a few items that schools commonly purchase that may be entirely non-domestic or partially non-domestic. And if a combination type item is comprised of at least 51% domestic product, then it counts as a domestic item and is not considered a non-domestic purchase that counts toward the 10% non-domestic purchase cap. The updated language about the Buy American provision also now includes a requirement that reference to the Buy American provision and its regulations must be included in all procurement that schools do, whether they engage in and use micro purchase procurement methodology, small purchase, or formal purchasing. And we'll talk more about the requirements for procurement language, so as far as Buy American goes later in the slides. Next slide. Thank you. As you saw a couple of slides ago, we are working toward a 5% non-domestic purchase cap. In school year 25-26, we are beginning this march downward with a 10% cap on non-domestic food purchases used in the school lunch and breakfast programs. Beginning in school year 28-29, the USDA will implement an 8% cap on those non-domestic purchases and ultimately will end up at that 5% cap beginning in school year 2031-2032. Next slide. So there are two limited exceptions that you can utilize to purchase a non-domestic product. And those include that the product is listed on the Federal Acquisitions Regulations Non-Available Articles list, where you can find that at the hyperlink for the Federal Regulation 48 CR 25.104. And in the slides you received in advance of this training, if you open that document up, you'll be able to click on the link on this slide and actually access that non-available articles list. These are items that are not produced in any volume and not available domestically by domestic production. Some of those examples are probably pretty common to you because you include them in your menuing regularly. Bananas, pineapple, mandarin oranges are very common examples of food items that are not available domestically, and every time a school purchases them, they are going to be a non-domestic item. Even though these items are not available domestically and are a non-domestic purchase that has no available alternative, they still do count toward the 10% cap on non-domestic purchases. And these items must be documented. And we'll talk more about how to complete that documentation later in the training. And Erica, if you go to the next slide, I know what you were showing us, and I kept talking a little bit longer.
No, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. It's for some reason it like keeps advancing on its own. I'm not touching anything. I even moved everything, so I don't know why it's advancing without me clicking to the next one. So
that happened to me
I
before. No.
guys. I don't know what's
No
going on.
worries. Yeah, this is what that non-available articles list looks like. And if you click on the link that I have at the bottom of this slide as well, it's the same one that was on the previous slide. It's going to take you directly to this federal resource that identifies non-available articles, meaning things not available by American production. You can see bananas, perhaps coconut used sometimes in school meals, or maybe grapefruit. Other citrus fruits, including mandarin oranges, are going to be on this list. So again, they're not available domestically. You could never purchase a domestic version of these. That means it's one of those limited exceptions to the Buy American provisions requirements, which of course require us to maximize our purchases of domestic items. This is one of those exceptions because there is no domestic production available for which we could, or from which we could purchase. You can head to the next slide, Erica. And the second of those limited exceptions is that you could purchase a non-domestic item if you conduct that price comparison and or competitive bids for items available both domestically and non-domestically, and that price comparison reveals that the cost of the domestic U.S. product is significantly higher than the non-domestic product. Where purchasing cucumbers, for example, could be exceptionally more expensive during some times of the school year when they're out of season in the US. The price of the domestic version is obviously going to be higher, and you may want to purchase the non-domestic cucumbers that might be imported from Mexico, for example. But you need to have done some investigation about that price comparison so that you can explain or justify or make the appropriate selection in the recording that you're doing for non-domestic products. So again, some items are not available domestically at all. They're on the non-available articles list. That's one of the available exceptions to the Buy American requirements. The other one is that food items are exceptionally more expensive during some times of the year. And the non-domestic version is much more reasonable as far as price or cost goes. Those still count toward the non-domestic purchase cap of 10%, but it's one of those reasons you can provide that explains why you chose to purchase a non-domestic item. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So it's of course not okay to operate on the assumption that your school does not purchase non-domestic items. Okay, if you have on your menu fruit juices, spices, perhaps conditioned yeast if you make your own bakery items, some fruits, even fruits used in mixed fruit dishes or mixed fruits of any kind, some vegetables, even vegetables that come to you as mixed vegetables, could be some domestic and non-domestic vegetables used to make that final product. And that's where that definition of substantially comes in, is at least 51% of all the vegetables in that final product you're using or purchasing grown domestically. If yes, then that counts as a domestic item that does not need to be included in your documentation of non-domestic foods. Okay, sometimes flours can be a mix of flour grown in the United States as well as abroad, or baking mixes can have a number of different ingredients or components, some of them domestic, some of them non-domestic. So ensuring that you meet the requirements means, in addition to communicating within your school nutrition team, you also have to communicate often with the representatives of the vendors you're purchasing from, making sure they know what you need from them as far as documentation goes, and that they provide you with what you need so that you can make sure you're appropriately recording all of the non-domestic purchases and that you have supporting documentation for those items you are buying. Next slide. Some school sites receive vended meals from another school. It's pretty common in Nebraska for a smaller non-public school food authority to purchase meals served to their students from a nearby or area local public school. And in that case, that vendor SFA, that is the school that's preparing and providing the meals, must track those non-domestic purchases. It's likely that in that case, the vendor SFA, the one making the meals for their own students, right, as well as the meals that are served to students of another small, likely non-public school, are preparing the same menu items, right? They're not preparing different things for the vended site compared to their own school students. They're probably preparing the same menu for both groups of students. And that means we are not going to require that you separate out the purchase and recording of non-domestic items for each school, right? The school that receives the meals could also receive a copy from the vendor school, the one making the meals, a copy of their tracking of the non-domestic purchases, and can use that as supporting documentation to comply with the Buy American provision. So separate tracking done by the vendor school is not necessary or required. If a vendor school has like a central food production facility at which they make a specific type of meal intended only for vended sites to receive, and those specific meals or menus are different from what the vendor school provides to its own students, then of course in that situation, separate tracking might be necessary. So if you have questions about that or want to work through details or logistics of the tracking for that sort of nuanced situation that might not be like every other agreement we have between schools, we encourage you to reach out to us so we can gather more information, get some additional details, and give you guidance that's going to help you comply with the requirements, be able to provide the needed documentation, but also try to find ways for it to be less, not overly burdensome or not more burdensome than it really has to be. Okay, next slide, Erica. So a few considerations and exceptions that I didn't talk about on that last slide, again pertaining to sites that receive vended meals, are that school food authorities that purchase any food that they serve directly to their students for breakfast maybe, or extra additional items they serve or sell at lunch, even though they get vended meals from that vendor SFA. Maybe they get only lunch from the vendor SFA, but they do their own breakfast. In that case, because that school is doing more than just paying an invoice to the vendor school, they are actually making their own food purchases for food items they serve to students at breakfast or lunch, they do need to track those non-domestic items for themselves. They would receive the non-domestic purchase information for the lunches or the items used to prepare the lunch meals they get from the vendor SFA, right? But if they're making any meals on their own or supplementing what they're getting from the vendor SFA to be able to sell a la carte items or just offer additional foods to their students, because that school makes its own food purchases, it does need to track those non-domestic products on its own, as well as receiving documentation for non-domestic food items used in the meals that they receive from the vendor SFA. I know that is a lot. We can come back to that if anyone in the group has questions. Next slide, Erica. What about milk? Well, most dairy is domestic, so likely doesn't need to be tracked. However, non-dairy milk substitutes might be non-domestic, and that means you need to be able to identify their country of origin. And if that is outside of the United States, then you must record those non-dairy substitutes in the non-domestic tracking. So dairy, cow's milk, is likely domestic, but the non-dairy substitutes that you might provide for a student preference or a disability, a medical reason of some kind is perhaps not domestic and is produced outside of the United States, therefore counts toward the non-domestic purchase cap and must be recorded. Next slide. Schools with food service management companies are a little bit different than those other types we talked about before, where a site receives meals vended from another school. In the situation with a management company, the school food authority has an agreement to participate in the school nutrition programs. That agreement is with the NDE, and that means that school must provide documentation of the non-domestic purchases. We cannot expect or rely on the food service management company to be providing that information to us upon request. The documentation of the non-domestic items that a food service management company purchases in order to prepare meals on behalf of a school nutrition program needs to be retained within the school food authority. So of course, that means that there needs to be communication and information sharing about how often and who will update the tracking documentation, and maybe some responsibility sharing, but certainly taking time and making it a point to discuss how that will operate or how that will work is important for schools that have management companies responsible for their school nutrition programs. So again, that SFA, the entity, the school that has the agreement with the NDE to participate in the school lunch program or school nutrition programs, is ultimately responsible for ensuring those non-domestic purchases are tracked correctly. Next slide. So as we've said several times, this tracking is absolutely required. It is not okay to assume your school does not purchase non-domestic items. If you serve fruit, juice, vegetables, many other things, but those primarily would be the sources of non-domestic food purchases in most situations. It's not possible to have only non-domestic purchases or items on your menu if you serve fruits, vegetables, and juices. And non-compliance would require corrective action. And if I ask you at the end of a school year to go back and record all of your non-domestic purchases, that sounds like a lot of work, right? And not complying from the get-go or not making effort to comply from the start certainly would create more work in the end. So really encourage you to hear what we're saying today, to share it with other people in your school who need to hear it, and to make time to think about and talk about and make a plan for executing what documentation needs to be maintained for this requirement. Next slide. So here we get to talk about the tracking. I've talked about how it's required, right? I've never shown you or told you yet how to do that. The USDA has made available a tracking tool that's an Excel file. We also made it available as a PDF that you could print and handwrite on, but it provides the columns of required, in some cases optional, if relevant, information related to each non-domestic item that your school food authority purchases. In the documentation, you need to record which school made the purchase, if that's applicable or relevant to your tracking, and for some school districts, it may not be. The same is true for the invoice number. That might be an optional piece of information, but if it helps you connect dots or connect the paper trail, of course, recording an invoice number might be something you want to do. You absolutely do need to record the date of the invoice, the source or seller or vendor from which that item was purchased. And again, this is all non-domestic items, whether they're on the non-available articles list or not. Any kind of non-domestic purchase that was made for food from your school food service account needs to be recorded in its own separate line on this tracking form. You're of course going to identify exactly what that product was, include which food component group it counts in or is, which food component group it counts in. And then you're going to record, of course, that it was a non-domestic item. And Erica, you can go to the next slide, which really is a picture of further right on this Excel file, if that's how we were viewing it. And then you're going to record the exception type. Again, we're recording every single non-domestic food item purchased that's served in breakfast and or lunch. Therefore, you would have to identify which of the two exceptions we talked about a little while ago are used to make this non-domestic purchase. It's only going to be one of those two options, right? Either it's not available domestically, which would be exception 1, or it's a purchase made using exception 2, which was the price difference being so great between the domestic and non-domestic version. The non-domestic one was much less expensive, and that's the rationale for making the purchase. So in every entry you have, you're going to make a selection, either exception 1 or exception 2. And then of course, you're going to record the total amount or purchase value of each of those individual items. That running total is going to populate at the bottom of the sheet, and that running total of non-domestic purchases will become the numerator, which you'll divide by your total food purchases to determine where you are according to the 10% cap or in relationship to the 10% non-domestic cap. So recording frequently, regularly, often is going to be important for making sure you have an understanding or an awareness of where your school is relative to that 10% cap. Waiting to do this until the end of the year would not work. If we conduct an administrative review of your school and determine none of this tracking has been done, we will ask you to go back to the first day of the school year that you made purchases and record everything from that day until the present. And that can end up being a lot of work. So we want you to get started doing this now. You're going to have to begin by communicating with your vendors or sellers, asking them to give you documentation you need to know the country of origin for the food items you're purchasing. And then record all of those items in the tracking tool, which you can use the Excel version for, or you can print the PDF we have available and handwrite those non-domestic purchase items there. Okay, moving on, Erica. Thank you. The Buy American tracking form is available at the link on this slide, which of course you got in advance of this training. The link here takes you to the NDE's Buy American webpage, which is another location that you can find access to the tools. The Excel file and the PDF version of that tracking tool we just looked at is there, along with some additional information and the recorded training of these slides. So like I said at the top of the presentation, if there's other folks at your school who need to hear and know about this information, who are not here today, but would benefit from hearing this, that's another way they can review the training and get some information and access the tools that they'll need to record information in. Next slide. So Buy American provision in school year 25-26 is intended to be used for your school to establish a baseline value of its non-domestic purchases. The USDA understands that complying with the 10% cap would be difficult for some school districts to do. Therefore, the intention of this year is to be educational and informative and give you an opportunity to build those communication relationships with your sellers or vendors, hoping you can begin to get all of the information you need regularly and in a clear format, as well as an opportunity to explore what menu adjustments you might need to do to help your school comply with the 10% cap. So really, this year is an opportunity for you to make those adjustments to menuing if and when possible, and an opportunity to establish those relationships with suppliers. They need to know what you need to have. They need to know that we should prioritize domestic items when the price is not unreasonable to do so. They also need to be aware of the kind of documentation that you need. And if they want to continue to sell to you, then they should be able to provide you with that additional documentation that you require. Next slide. There are, of course, those two exceptions to the Buy American requirement. The items that are not produced domestically is one, and the second is those items that are significantly more expensive for the domestic version compared to the non-domestic one. So with documentation, schools can exceed the 10% non-domestic purchase threshold or cap with only foods that meet those two exception criteria. You cannot purchase non-domestic cucumbers if you don't have proof that the price difference between the domestic and non-domestic is significant. You cannot say, well, I got these non-domestic cucumbers, it's just what my vendor gave me, and I never really asked about anything else, right? That wouldn't work. We need you to tell us or show us what information or work you shared or work you did with your vendor to determine that you are going to receive non-domestic cucumbers at any time during the school year, okay? Or it has to be an item that's not available domestically. Pineapple, mandarin oranges, bananas are examples, right? Okay, so if you want to use this exception or accommodation, you've got to do three things. Inform the NDE by submitting an accommodation request, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Make progress toward that prescribed threshold of 10% non-domestic purchases. Again, that goes back to the previous slide where we present this as an opportunity to make some menu adjustments if you can, and to open up those lines of communication with your vendors or suppliers, or to find different vendors and suppliers who can give you the domestic version of an item when it's available and not significantly more expensive. And then also demonstrate your effort to be compliant with that 10% non-domestic purchase cap. And you would do that by adjusting menus, showing us that you're interacting and getting price quotes and bids, and communicating with a variety of vendors who can meet your needs. Some of them may be more able to provide domestic items that you need at a reasonable price. So it's all about demonstrating that effort to comply with the cap, even though we know this year that might be very difficult to do. This year is that year where you get to establish some communication and expectations with your suppliers or vendors in terms of what information and documentation you need and what kinds of products you need as well. Next slide. So submitting that accommodation request should be done only one time in the school year, and only after forecasting and doing some of this work to become compliant reveals that you still cannot comply with the 10% non-domestic purchase cap. This accommodation request needs to include the details for all of the non-domestic food component items or groups of items purchased that contributed toward exceeding the 10% cap. Please do not submit an accommodation request for every non-domestic purchase you make, right? That sounds like a lot of time and work. We need you to make one comprehensive accommodation request that reflects all of the food items or types of foods you are purchasing that contributed to exceeding the cap. Just one request, probably a little bit later in the school year, after you've made some effort to sort of like make adjustments to see if you could be compliant with the 10% cap. When it's revealed that that is not going to be possible, that's when we want you to submit that accommodation request form. Okay, next slide. USDA Foods, food items served in the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program, which is a separate grant program that's not like DoD favors or anything like that, as well as after-school snack, are exempt from the Buy American Provisions requirements. Of course, USDA foods are not commercial purchases. You're not spending money on USDA foods from your food service account in order to get them, right? You get an allocation, and you place your orders based on the allocation for your school. It's not a purchase you're making. Therefore, those items do not need to be included in the calculation of compliance with the non-domestic cap. The Fresh Fruit Vegetable Program items are also not included in the non-domestic purchase cap. If you purchase Fresh Fruit Vegetable Program items like on their own, they have their own separate invoice, those are things you would not need to record in that tracking tool. However, if you purchase bananas used in both breakfast and or lunch, as well as the Fresh Fruit Vegetable Program, it's at your discretion if you want to appropriately and correctly divide up the purchase amount for the breakfast and lunch bananas that must be recorded and the Fresh Fruit Vegetable Program bananas, We're hopeful that you're not serving a lot of those same items. Of course, the fresh fruit vegetable program is intended to expose students to some of the things they see in the fresh fruit vegetable bar at the regular mealtime, but also some new and different items too. So though those FFVP items don't count toward the cap, it's up to you to determine how it's best to make sure you record all of the items used in breakfast and lunch and whether or not those FFVP things are included in that tracking, sort of depending on how complicated that could be for you. Additionally, foods served for after-school snack are also not included in the non-domestic purchase cap. Even if you're purchasing non-domestic items for after-school snack, they do not need to be recorded in the tracking form. You still do need to make effort to primarily purchase domestically produced items in the snack program, right? We would give technical assistance if we see that is not happening, because there are plenty of domestically produced items that are suitable for snacks. You just don't need to record it in the non-domestic tracking sheet. Okay, next. So let's review. Some of those Buy American basics include that all foods that you purchase and use in breakfast and lunch that are not produced in the US have to be included in your determination of whether you're meeting the non-domestic purchase cap of 10%, and you have to document those items in the tracking tool. USDA foods are not commercial purchases, right? Those are things you do not need to include in the tracking, nor those items used exclusively in the fresh fruit vegetable program or in the after-school snack program. But it's at your discretion. If it's a difficult thing to divide that out and it's easier to just record everything in the tracking tool, you can do that. Oops, sorry, you can go on to the next one. Thank you. And it's also required that if you cannot comply with the 10% cap, that your school must submit one entry of the accommodation request. Again, we want you to make effort to try to comply by making menu adjustments, communicating closely with your vendor or suppliers so they can prioritize domestic items in that effort to help you comply. But we understand this is a year of learning and making adjustments, and it's possible that the 10% cap is just too low. Once you realize that, you should submit that accommodation request. You can go to the next slide. And this is a copy of our electronic accommodation request. Of course, there's much more to it, and I identify those data pieces on the next slide, so you can head there, Erica. We need to know from each school, of course, what your school name is, as well as your 6-digit agreement number. That agreement number is essential for us to make sure we have the appropriate response recorded from each school, and we have some non-publics that have very similar or same names, so we'd hate to get you mixed up with someone else or not record your response because we didn't get that agreement number. We need to know who to contact at your school. Who's the person responsible for submission of that request, and who's responsible for making purchases and recording? Is there a point person we can connect with to provide technical assistance? Is really the goal of that contact person being identified. As I mentioned before, in this form, you'll identify the category of the food component items that you're purchasing that are non-domestic. Give us a brief explanation for the request. I've made menu adjustments, right? I've worked with my vendor. They cannot give me domestic this, and this. The kids like this food, right? It's a food we serve often because we know they enjoy it. And that's why I need to request this accommodation for school year 25-26. We also want to know you've put some thought into what additional changes or strategies you might use to help comply with the 10% cap. And that's what that final piece of information we ask for in that accommodation request form is geared toward getting. We want to know you're trying to get this done. That good faith effort is so important. So that's what we want you to share with us at the bottom of that accommodation request. You can head to the next slide. So let's review. When it comes to tracking and compliance, which is essential for this Buy American provision and its changes, you need to track all non-domestic purchases of food items served at breakfast and lunch, okay? Those details need to include the date, the specific item, from where you purchased it, and the total dollar amount. because that's really the only way to determine that numerator of the fraction you need to assess whether you're complying with the 10% cap. And you can highlight that next one, Erica. And you got to ask yourself, is my school on a trajectory to exceed that cap? And am I doing everything I can right now to help us not exceed that, right? If both of those answers are yes, that's when you would submit the single Buy American accommodation request that's going to provide all those details we covered on the previous slide. Go ahead, next one. As I mentioned at the top of this training, or this Buy American section of today's training, there has been additional language regarding the requirements to include the Buy American provision in all procurement practices and solicitations done by schools. So schools have got to include, it's a requirement, we're going to look for it, the Buy American provision in their procurement practices, in their solicitations for bids or proposals, and in any final contracts that are executed. Okay, the Buy American provision requirements have got to be included no matter what kind of procurement you use, whether it's the informal micro purchase option, small purchase, or the formal RFP or IFB. We want to see that language. And again, like I said, it has to be included in all finalized contracts between a school and a supplier or vendor or a management company. And next slide. On this one, you see I used artificial intelligence to draft for me some basic Buy American provision language that I would include in a request for proposal or invitation for bid, right? It identifies the program regulation 7 CFR 21021D, and then says all apples that I purchase from you, vendor, must be grown, harvested, and packed in the United States. The vendors certify compliance with the provision. There are those 2 limited exceptions that the vendor would need to communicate or make the school food authority aware of if it uses, and then that they provide the appropriate documentation to support whether the purchase was domestically grown or non-domestic. Okay, next slide. So those questions you want to ask suppliers include some here. This is not an exhaustive list. I know you'll think of others that are important for you. But first of all, are you aware of the Buy American provision and that I have to comply with a 10% cap of non-domestic items for all the foods I purchase that are served at breakfast and lunch? And I should let you know, I did hold a Buy American provision training for all the vendors I could contact names who I knew might be out and about, who I heard from other schools. Help me aggregate this list. I had pretty good participation in that, but I know not everyone who needed to hear the information was there, right? Make contact with your representative, your account manager, and let them know that that training is available on the NDE's website on the Buy American page. Ask them if they've watched it, right? If not, encourage them to do that, but also just say, I got to have additional information. I can't do my job if I don't get this from you. But their awareness is going to be one of the most important things to start with. Ask them how they're going to support your compliance by providing the necessary documentation. And ask them what documentation they will provide to help you track. Are they going to give you a seasonality chart that says in August through November, the cucumbers are domestic? In December through March, they come from Mexico. And then beginning in April and throughout May, they're domestic again. Or is it identified on every invoice, perhaps? I mean, those are the kinds of things you got to work out with them so that you know what you can expect, and then you can ensure that it's meeting your needs. We talked a little bit about those combination type things. A pizza crust is a good example, a pizza dough mix rather, I'm sorry, or even a crust, right? The supplier should identify all the ingredients and their source, or should be able to give you sort of an attestation or certification sheet that says Katie Parch's magical pizza dough mix is 51% domestic ingredients, right? It's substantially domestic. Okay, next slide. So some questions you might want to ask yourself, maybe about your top 3 non-domestic menu items as a place to start. Would a domestic version of this be available if I used a different supplier? Can I swap any non-domestic items for locally produced items? And Nebraska has a really robust farm to school program and tons of resources to support that. One of the places you might start are with those resources we have for Nebraska Thursdays, as well as Harvest of the Month. And early in the school year would be the best time to maximize those Harvest of the Month items and inclusion of those in your menus, just because of the growing season in Nebraska. We get a lot of great stuff available in the fall. So you could sort of get a head start on reducing that percent of purchases that are non-domestic when we've got a bounty of options and availability in Nebraska in the fall. And then how am I going to provide the information to others at my school? Or how am I going to get it from other people at my school? How can I initiate communication with others in a way that's geared toward or supportive of our school's compliance with this requirement? You can brainstorm yourself or with your teammates to figure out best strategies for that communication component. Next slide. So let's recap. I know I've taken up a lot of my time and I haven't left a ton for questions, but hopefully we can get through all of those. But before I get to the end, want you to know that we're available to answer questions anytime you have them. And we'd rather answer those up front to give you support on the front end versus the back end and having to fix things, which often requires going back in time and making adjustments. And that can end up being more time consuming for you, which we want to avoid. We understand your jobs are big and they're busy. So remember, track all non-domestic purchases, whether they are not available domestically, those items are not available domestically, or they are sometimes. Do not assume you have no non-domestic items. If you serve fruits, vegetables, juice, which every school does, something in there is non-domestic, right? Try your best to stay at or beneath that 10% non-domestic cap, or at least demonstrate that effort to adjust your purchases and or menuing so you can work toward or demonstrate you're working toward that compliance. And again, if you know you cannot adhere to the 10% cap, please submit that accommodation request one time, but be ready to explain what effort you've taken to comply with the cap, as well as what additional steps you're considering to become compliant with the 10% cap. Next slide. I think it might be time for questions, right?
Ending this session now and moving on to the second part of our presentation. And Katie, I'm going to let you just lead in what else is on our to-do list.
Yep.
It seems long, but they're short topics.
They are. They're short topics, just little tidbits on reminders for what you need to know that remains for like the next couple of months, getting you started in the school year. We're going to cover a little bit of reminders about the direct certification of students for meal benefits, especially as it pertains to any newly enrolled students who you've added since the first day of school or since you last provided enrollment information that's used for direct certification matching. We also will cover a little bit about carryover of meal benefits from the prior school year, reminding you the day those need to end and what that means for those students. A reminder about submitting your school meals app, some other reporting, including food safety, reminders about submitting monthly claims and how important that edit check is. Coming down the road a little bit later, like October and November, would be reminders about verification. We'll talk a little bit about that, and even further into the future, the requirement to conduct those on-site reviews for some schools or buildings. And then we'll cover some other important dates to carry you through the rest of the school year. You can head to the next page, Erica. So direct certification, of course, is ongoing. And you know that direct cert is a way we identify students eligible for free or reduced price meals because they participate in another benefit program that's administered by the Nebraska Department of DHHS that qualifies those students for, like I said, the free or reduced price meals. And we match, of course, enrollment information for students enrolled in your district with information we receive from the DHHS. So if you uploaded student enrollment information directly into the CNP's direct certification system, like you see on the page here, that's the picture on the right-hand side, that displays a successful upload of enrollment information. That's great, right? That information in there is what we use to match with first name, last name, gender, and date of birth from information we receive from DHHS. If you've had newly enrolled students since you last completed that upload of enrollment information, we want to make sure those newly enrolled students are matched or identified as eligible for meal benefits in a timely manner. So we're going to talk about how we can do that. If you could head to the next slide. So again, it's a federal requirement that schools at a minimum provide updated student enrollment data or information at least 3 times each school year. And for public schools, that's an easy, hands-off sort of thing to do because the NDE's advisor system will begin communicating and getting enrollment information daily from the school's student information system beginning here very soon, approximately September 15th. So it's really easy for a public school to comply with that federal requirement that's at the top of the screen, right? That daily provision of student data, of course, adheres to the minimum of 3 times a year for providing enrollment data. Non-public schools are different. Even if they have a student information system, it does not and is not required to provide that daily enrollment information or data file with the advisor system. So we don't have that automated or automatic way of sharing the information, which makes it important to engage with the system periodically, again, at least 3 times a year, but more often is better. Regularly updating student enrollment in Person ID Advisor system, or by uploading any file you have of new students that enroll in the district, like once every month, is another great way to provide that enrollment information that's used for matching. Of course, we want to provide eligible students with meal benefits they should have. An additional benefit on the school side of that is that it can help reduce or prevent overdue balances that students can acquire if they are not identified in a timely manner as eligible for meal benefits, right? That's a time cost to folks who work in school nutrition to follow up with households that have an overdue balance, or if a student is identified as eligible sort of like later, then reversing those charges and adjusting past claims is a cost to your time. It's much more time efficient and effective to regularly update enrollment information and make sure you're adding any newly transferred in students so that if they're also in the DHHS data, they're matched and identified in your match list. Okay, next slide, please. A student upload is, of course, successful when you see the table at the bottom of the enrollment page in the direct search system is populated. Okay, so if you try to upload a file, it looks like it's processing, but the table at the bottom doesn't end up having any data. That means it actually was not successful. The system has no enrollment information to use for matching. If you experience that challenge, make sure to reach out to one of us and send us your file. We can help troubleshoot and then can upload that successfully for you. You can go to the next slide. One thing we want to make sure you're aware of is that, that error message, like you see here in the yellow banner, on the bottom half of that picture means the file didn't successfully upload. So that's another instance where you'd want to send us your file because we can help you and troubleshoot for you. Enrollment errors might occur if there's a field in a student row in the upload file that was blank or didn't have the correct number of characters, or maybe it was formatted incorrectly. So sometimes those can hold up or prevent a student from matching. Perhaps we want to help you correct those. And the best way for you to do that is to go back to your file, locate that student, figure out where it was in the sheet that yellow highlight is coming from or generated from, and fix that. And then I also want to make sure you know that the red text at the top, right under Show Help, does display a message that for many schools is inaccurate or incorrect. It says the following schools have not uploaded any data. If you see student data on the lower half of this page, as in your file was successfully uploaded, that red text at the top means nothing to you, right? It doesn't apply to you. Not sure why it continues to happen. Tried to troubleshoot it, haven't been successful, but want to make sure you know. If you see kids or students uploaded in the red box in the bottom right corner of this picture, it says showing 1 of 15 of 43,851 results or students. That's another way to say or to determine or confirm your upload was successful. You want the number of results displayed on that page to match the number of students you intended to enroll or that were in your upload file. If there's a discrepancy there, then again, send your file to us. We can help troubleshoot and figure out what row it was that the upload stopped, because it probably means a little piece of data needs some fixing. Okay, next slide. Those common enrollment record errors include not utilizing a 3-digit building code, using a single digit like 1 in column A, or using the full like 10-digit county district, school district agreement number and building number. That's way too long. Column A needs only 3 numbers or 3 digits. Sometimes students may have different last names between what you enroll and maybe what the DHHS data says. Sometimes you could have duplicate entries in the enrollment, which really isn't a bad thing. It doesn't prevent matching, but it definitely makes your enrollment list look a lot longer. And if you like a very clean list, those duplicates can prevent that. Missing or incomplete NDE student IDs can be a problem. Students have to have an NDE ID generated through the Person ID system for them to be successfully identified as a match for meal benefits. We also need you to know that you should enter the gender as a single letter, M or F. Do not spell those out. If you use an incorrect file format that does not follow what the template for enrollment upload requires, that's going to cause an error that prevents a successful upload. So make sure you go grab that template from the enrollment tab of the Direct Cert system. It gives it to you right there at the top, says click here to get the template. That's the one you should be using. It's formatted correctly and has all the required columns or pieces of information. Next slide, thank you. You can also complete identification of matches using the individual student lookup, either with the student's NDE ID, which of course is connected to their first, last name, date of birth, and gender, or by using each of those pieces of information to conduct the student lookup. This would be an option if you have just one student who enrolled last week, you haven't had any others, meaning there's not really a need to put a new batch of students in an enrollment file and use that option. It's sort of just a one-off, kiddo. And then that means you could use, and maybe would prefer to use, the student lookup option for any like single addition in the last week or the last month. And like I said, you don't have a need to put a bunch of students in a new batch like upload file, just a single student. This is a way you could do that. So you're going to, again, enter all that information and then submit the search queue button, or click that button in the bottom right corner. And then it's going to display the results for you. And then you would get to review, yep, that student is a match for you by confirming the first and last name, date of birth, and gender displayed on the screen. Match all of those pieces of information that you have for that student in your school records. Be very careful here. Sometimes first and last names can be the same, and the date of birth can be slightly different, and the gender can be the same. Pay really close attention here. We have had schools accept students who were not theirs, and then the household gets a letter that says their student was directly certified, and they're wondering why. I don't get SNAP. No one in my house gets SNAP. And it's those incorrect matches that are the reason for that. So just pay close attention to those details when you're accepting or reviewing those matches. Next slide. Yeah, this is where you would review all those pieces of information. And then when you would accept the match by clicking the green match button. If there was a discrepancy that made you question, wonder, or think, no, this isn't the student enrolled at my school, of course, that's when you'd click the orange no match button. But by clicking the green one, that student is then going to appear with a list date of the date you made the match in the match list. So that list date is important for us knowing when that meal benefit was effective and how that corresponds to how that student's meals were counted and claimed. Next slide. Is this still me? It must be. As we move toward the 30th operating day of school in 25-26, and that date's a little bit different for everybody here, remember that carryover of the school year 24-25 meal benefits needs to end on the 30th day of school. So those students who received free or reduced price meals at the end of the school year in 24-25, of course, begin the new school year with that same benefit for up to 30 school days or until a new eligibility determination is made, whichever of those comes first. So if they submitted a meal application that showed they exceed the income guidelines for both free and reduced price meals, the application was determined eligible for paid price meals, and this was done on September 2nd, well, that's the date that the meal benefits need to be updated for that student, even though that was before the 30th day of school in the new school year. So if no new determination is made, they're not on the match list now like they used to be, and they didn't submit a meal application, or they did and they were over the income guidelines, that student eligibility, of course, needs to be changed to paid. And SFAs should notify households in advance to help them avoid unpaid meal charges. Remind them of the availability of the meal application. Encourage them to complete it if they think they're eligible. Some might be, and that, again, like the slide says, will help prevent some of those unpaid meal charges.
Thanks, Katie. Up next, we're going to go just go through some additional program requirements that are due now or coming up in September and October. And the first one is the school meals application in CMP. As a reminder, the due date to submit the school meals application in CMP was August 15th. So if you haven't submitted that yet, please take a moment to make that one of your top priorities in getting that submitted. If your application has not been approved, we do ask that you just please go in and check the status of your application to make sure that the status in the upper right-hand corner says submitted for approval, that it's under review by the state or that it's been approved. And then that's how you'll know that it went through correctly. If your application status says not submitted or not started or returned for correction, then you do need to go back and complete it, make any corrections, and then make sure you click on that red submit for approval button so that it comes to us, your program specialist, for approval. A lot of times applications are returned for corrections and you go in and you make that correction, but then maybe you never click on that red submit for approval button again. So it's not submitted for your program specialist to approve it. It's important to remember that you cannot submit your monthly claim for reimbursement until your application has been fully approved. This includes the operational dates in the site application. So if you're having issues submitting your August claim for reimbursement, it's either because you haven't submitted your application, it's not approved, or maybe you're missing those operational dates in your site applications or the dates you entered are incorrect. So if you go into your application and make any changes, once again, just please remember to click on your submit for approval button so that it can come back to us and we can get it approved for you. The approval process does happen in the order that the applications are received, and it's dependent on the availability of your program specialist reviewing them. So the sooner you can get it submitted, the sooner it can be processed and you can submit that claim. If you do run into any issues, don't hesitate to contact us here at NDE Nutrition Services. We're here to help you get that application submitted. There's also an application guide that we can send to you if you like to see it on paper, or give us a call and we can just walk through the application together and get it done. And finally, just a big thank you to those that have already have your application submitted. We appreciate you just staying on top of that requirement. Along with submitting your school meals application in CNP, there's another important step that you'll need to complete under the Applications tab, and this is the Food Safety Inspections report. This is where you're going to report the number of health inspections each of your sites received for school year 24-25. So for last school year, you're reporting what happened last school year. To find this, you're going to click Applications in the blue navigation bar and then select Food Safety Inspections. The deadline to submit this report is October 15th. So coming up here in about a month, a little bit over a month away. We do encourage you to go ahead and complete it at the same time that you do your school meals application to save time having to go back in, and it just ensures that you're in compliance then that you've completed that report. For each site, you're just going to simply enter the number of inspections received, so either 0, 1, or 2 inspections, the number that you've received. If you're unsure of the numbers, you can check with your food service director. If you're a bookkeeper, check with your food service director, since they're typically the ones who work with the health inspectors on those food safety inspections. It's important to complete this because we at NDE Nutrition Services do have to send this data to USDA each year. So any missing reports could be considered non-compliance, and a hold could be placed on your claim if it's not completed by the 15th of October. So please go get those in by the October 15th. Just some reminders on submitting the August claim for reimbursement. For each claim, remember that one of the steps you need to complete is completing that edit check worksheet. That's attachment J on our website and also in your handout packet on pages 9 and 10 of your handout packet. It's just an important internal control to make sure that your meal counts and claims line up correctly with what you're actually submitting for reimbursement. Like I said, it's available on our website. It's available in both a PDF document and an Excel file on our website. If your system does an edit check, you can also use your system edit check as long as it provides the needed information. So this needs to be completed monthly and kept on file with your claim. And then to receive timely payment, we do ask that you submit your claim by the 10th of the month. So today's September 10th, so if it would be great if you could get your claims in by the 10th of the month for timely payment. You do have up until 60 days after the end of the month to submit a claim, but submitting early just helps ensure that you receive your payments on schedule and that you don't forget to submit your claims. So remember to submit those claims. If you haven't done that yet, you should be able to go ahead and submit an August claim as long as your application is approved. Currently, our claims are only being processed once per month. So once again, getting those in early helps you receive more timely payment. And then do verify your claim is in accepted status. If it's, stuck in pending status or has an error, that means it hasn't gone through yet and it won't be paid until that's corrected. Anytime you go in and make a change to your claim, you need to be sure that it goes back to accepted status to be paid for reimbursement. And just a short little reminder that verification is also coming up. If you're new to the program, verification is the process of confirming eligibility for free and reduced priced meal benefits. Every year, school food authorities, or SFAs, must verify a sample. That's 3% of your approved applications, and to ensure accuracy. So you are double checking that what they submitted on their paper application is correct. This process you can actually start verification anytime, but the number of applications you have to approve is calculated as of the number on file October 1st. And then you need to be done with the verification process by November 15th. So we recommend that you start early. That way there's enough time to reach all the families and collect the documentation you need. One key point to remember is that verification applies only to households approved by application. So directly certified students, if they're on your DC list, those students are not subject to verification. Verification must include confirmation of either income eligibility, if the household submitted a case number for SNAP, FDPIR, or TANF, you would need to verify that, or any other source categorical eligibility, such as foster children. On the documentation, the forms available on our website and the documentation you're going to send to the households, it does tell them what they would need to submit for each of those categories. And you will be receiving email communication later in September regarding verification. So more information for now can be found on our Nutrition Services website under verification, and that link there on the slide. And Katie will be sending an email out later in September that gives you a lot more information about verification, the process, and what you need to do to complete verification. On our website, there is also a pre-recorded training on verification under that verification link if you want to go and watch that to prepare as well. Another thing we wanted to make you aware of is during this training is the requirement to complete the attachment I, the on-site reviews. Attachment I must be completed by SFAs with more than one feeding site. It should be completed by either the authorized representative or a bookkeeper. You must conduct one review for all sites serving lunch and for 50% of the sites serving breakfast. These need to be completed by February 1st of 2026, but you can conduct them at any time before that date. So if you want to do them now, that's fine. You can go ahead and get them started, but they need to be done by February 1st of 2026. And then you just maintain these on-site reviews on-site. They're not submitted to us at Nutrition Services unless we specifically request them as part of an administrative review or something like that. We do check those during administrative reviews. The form can be found on our website under Forms and Resources, and also in your handout packet on pages 11 and 12 of your handout packet. In addition, if you operate the after-school snack program, there are also required on-site reviews for that program as well. So each site operating an after-school snack program must be reviewed either by the school district, or if you're an RCCI, by the RCCI 2 times per year. The first review must be completed during the first 4 weeks of operation. So that's probably coming up here for a lot of you. So if you operate the after school snack program and you haven't completed that review yet, make sure that you get that done within those first 4 weeks of operation, or as soon as possible within those first 4, if your 4 weeks have already passed. The second review can be any time during the remainder of the school year, but you do have to complete 2. Just keep these reviews, once again, keep these on file with your other records pertaining to the after-school snack program. This form is available on our website, and then also in your handout packet on page 13 of your handout packet we sent today. And finally, just to wrap up here, just kind of a summary of all those important dates and things we went over in this last portion of the training. The first one is your 30th school day or your 30th operating day. Like Katie went over, carryover of the previous meals eligibility ends for students who have not been determined eligible for meal benefits for school year 25-26. So if they haven't submitted an application, they haven't appeared on your direct certification list, then on that 30th school day after lunch, they move to paid status. So by that 31st school day at lunchtime, students referenced above in the carryover do move to paid status. In September, remember to conduct that first on-site review for your after-school snack program. October 1st is technically the start of the verification process, and an email from Katie will be coming out soon. So October 1st is the date that you can calculate how many applications that you need to verify. And then October 13th through 17th of 2025 is National School Lunch Week. So just remember to celebrate that and celebrate your school lunch professionals. We've seen here today that they have a lot of work to do, and so it's important to celebrate them as well. October 15th, record the number of food safety inspections in CMP. So that's the date that you need to have those food safety inspections recorded in CMP. And then October 31st is, like Katie said, you need to update your enrollment at least 3 times a year. That's a federal requirement. So in our important dates, we've identified October 31st as one of those dates to make sure you've checked your enrollment, you've updated any data for new or transfer students so that they will match in that DC system. But really, we want you doing that as any new or transfer students come in. But we've identified October 31st as one of those dates to be sure that you do that if you're not doing it on a regular basis already. Your important dates handout is, we've included this before, but it's in your handout packet on pages 14 through 16 if you want to refer to that. We just have our non-discrimination statement for the school meals program. And then finally, we want you to take a few minutes to complete this short evaluation of today's training.